Hello and welcome to ONS Energy Talks. My name is Ørjan Heradstveit. I work as a project manager for the ONS Foundation, and I'm here on secondment from Equinor. We are currently experiencing unprecedented and dramatic times for the whole of the global energy industry. To try to make sense of what is happening, we have initiated a fortnightly commentary written by Mr. Nick Butler. Nick is a member of the ONS Advisory Board and a regular contributor in the energy and economy columns of the Financial Times. This blog material will be distributed through our channels to all our friends and partners across the world. Now, drifting back to today's program, the coronavirus has demonstrated in the harshest possible way that we are all in this together. Together is the theme of this year's ONS, and we hope by encouraging to an open discussion that we can go through and emerge from the crisis with a full understanding of the interdependent world in which we live. I'm therefore delighted to have with me Mr. Nick Butler here today. Welcome to Energy Talks, Nick.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope everybody is safe and well, and I hope this technology works.
Excellent. Nick, from your home base in Wales, only a couple of hours drive west of London, how do you assess the UK approach and measures to overcome the coronavirus situation we are in?
Well, I think people are doing their best. We were somewhat unprepared. We didn't have the testing equipment. We didn't expect it to evolve here in quite the way that it has. There are still a lot of unknowns, and the experts are watching the statistics every day and very carefully. I think it's brought out the best and some of the worst. I think there are a lot of people who are making a huge contribution to help other people, to help the health service, people who are obeying the rules and staying at home and working like this online. There are a few people who are bending the rules, but they are very few. I think it's, we today, for instance, the government managed to open a huge hospital in the east of London that has, I think it's going to have 5,000 beds. And that has been created over a week, 1 week, and it's now being staffed, and it's full of basic equipment. It obviously needs more, but it is a sign that people are responding very well, and I think we'll get through it. I think that it's going to be very, very painful for those who lose their loved ones, but the rest of the country is showing that we still have the spirit to get through this.
Thank you, Nick, for this good overview you gave us. But Nick, this pandemic surely is a massive one. And when we spoke the other day, you referred to the pandemic with a saying, and let me quote you, "What you do not know is the beginning of good strategic thinking and planning." My question is, was the world prepared to handle the extent of such a pandemic crisis?
No, clearly not. People had talked about pandemics. They talked about the risk of things spreading very quickly in a globalized world. Some people, some companies had emergency plans. Some governments had emergency plans. But when it happens, you realize what you don't know. And we didn't know. I don't think any government knew how fast it would spread. The fact that it spreads more quickly in some countries than others, for no obvious rational reason that I've seen yet. We don't know how long it will last. Everybody is watching these curves of how it develops day by day, but they actually tell you only part of the truth. In this country, they tell you the numbers who have died in hospital. They've only just begun to add to that the numbers who have died at home or in nursing homes. So the statistics are not precise, and we have to acknowledge that we don't know that. So we're struggling to latch on to any elements of fact that we can find in order to handle this in the best way. And I think that that's true of the energy market too. There's a lot that we don't know. I think there's been a lot of rather loose talk and false speculation in the media suggesting how bad this is going to be. And I think there's been a lot of market speculation by the traders, which has driven prices down to what I think are ridiculously low levels. I don't think that's at all sustainable. And they are trading on day-to-day fears. I don't think they're looking through at the strategic reality of this, which is that it's a very bad event. Terrible for those directly involved, but it does not bring the world to an end.
We all agree, Nick, that the media is an extremely useful source during such a crisis. On the contrary, however, some medias highlight extreme numbers that can be hard for people to relate to. And perhaps they tend to forget the cautionary notes which honest forecasters always include. How would you, Nick, describe the situation we're facing seen from an energy and economic angle?
I think it's a time of great difficulty for the industry. I don't agree with the characterization that it's the worst crisis the industry has faced in 100 years. That is just not true. We're going to have a very bad quarter of low demand this quarter, second quarter of 2020. That is because people are being told to stay at home in this country, in your country, around the world. And that is taking a lot of demand away, particularly from the transport sector. The government here have been showing us our numbers, and I think they're reflected in other countries around the world. People are not moving around. But an awful lot of life is still going on. And I don't think that some of the media are quite reflecting that. I think it's very important now to acknowledge what we don't know and to look very carefully at some leading indicators that can show us how this is really developing in real life rather than in the newspapers or on television. I agree, the journalists are doing a good job in many ways in bringing facts to us, in telling us things. I think they're doing a less good job in bringing speculation. And I think what we should do, and I hope what ONS can do in the run-up to the conference with events like this, is to bring people a slightly better understanding of how to look at what's happening worldwide. We can't give perfect knowledge, nobody has that, but a slightly more subtle and careful way of understanding how things are really developing.
You mentioned some indicators, Nick. Can you elaborate a little bit more around these indicators?
Okay, well, let me do them. Shall we do them one by one? I have 4. And if you want to ask me about any of them, I'm happy to try and talk about them. I think the first one that we should watch from now on is the level of industrial production in China. Everybody has their role in the energy world. All the people watching this, all your members and supporters and partners. But it's very important to look at the world market as a whole, because that is what in the end sets the price, not speculation, but the underlying fundamentals. And the fundamental that has driven the price down is the fall in Chinese demand because of what's happened in Wuhan and other areas of China. As I read the reports, that now seems to be stabilizing and people are beginning to return to work. I haven't seen any hard numbers yet, but the numbers I will be looking for are the hard data on industrial production in Wuhan and elsewhere, which are publicly available and are reasonably reliable. So I'll be looking for those. I think it matters because China is now, and people still don't realize this, the consumer of 25% of all the energy used in the world every day. 25%. And it is the importer of almost 1/5 of all the oil traded in the world. And that's 10 or 11 million barrels a day before this crisis. That has obviously fallen in the last month. It will be very, very important to understand how that statistic moves over the next 3 months. So that's the first indicator. Then my second one, and I'm trying to gather the data on this, and I would welcome any input from anybody watching this, is the investment decisions being taken by the large international companies. And by that I include both the privately owned ones, the IOCs, and the state-owned ones, such as Aramco and Rosneft. And their investment is very important in defining what the levels of production in the years ahead will be. We've seen quite large announcements so far. BP made an announcement this morning. I've seen something from Equinor in Norway. I haven't seen the full list yet. And companies are still working hard to get their numbers right. And so are governments. And I think the choice that the industry has in these different places, in Western countries, I think the choice for companies is between maintaining their dividends, which are very important for funds that depend on them, and the level of investment they have. If their revenue has gone down, they can't do everything. They have a choice. I think in the state-owned companies, it is a choice between whether the government allows them to keep investing or whether the government needs any revenue that's available to fund all the other activities that government's responsible for. And when you get to those real investment numbers, the number of projects that have been put off or postponed or dropped, you begin to see what the production profile going forward might be. And I think there may be a challenge in that. I'm not criticizing any of the companies for what they're doing. They are doing what they have to do, but it has consequences. And that is one of the things I'd like to look at.
Could
the
I have
third one, which is more, sorry, Ørjan, please.
Could I have one just adding to that, your explanations around the investments? Do you think that investments will change in terms of we're kind of in a start of the energy transformation phase, but will we see a kind of a structure and different types of investments in the future, which kind of not goes that much into the energy transformation and new energy forms?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know the answer yet. I think it will depend company by company what they do. What seems very likely is that they won't invest in the very high cost projects because the price now is so low. And I think even when, as I expect, it bounces back somewhat, I don't think it's going to justify projects that need $80, $90, $100 a barrel Brent prices, or perhaps gas prices, which have come down almost as much, if not more, than oil. So I think that people will be reassessing every project against a lower, not this low, but a lower level of realizable prices, and some things will change. Now, I suspect, and it's another point on my list here, is that the climate debate is not over. It's been taken out of the headlines. It's no longer the top of the news as it was at the beginning of this year. But I think there are two processes still going forward that are going to put it back on the table when this crisis comes to an end, as it will. And that is, first of all, the US presidential election, where it's now pretty clear that you will have Mr. Trump on one side with his energy policies against a Democratic candidate who is ahead in the polls at the moment, who is saying that he will stop fracking, who is saying that the US is going to move very radically and quite quickly away from fossil fuels. Now, I take political rhetoric with a pinch of salt, but I think that the divergence of those sort of commitments between the two parties in the US is very important and will shape how the industry develops in the future. I also think that the European Green Deal, which was promulgated and put forward at the end of last year by the Commission and is now under detailed discussion, that's out of the headlines at the moment, but I think that will come back before the end of the year when the crisis comes to an end. And I think quite a lot of the proposals within that Green Deal proposition will be taken forward, and that companies working in Europe and close to Europe in places like Norway can't ignore that direction of policy change. So the coronavirus crisis is not the only thing going on in the world, and the climate agenda, though the voice is much quieter now than it was, has not gone away. The fourth point is the immediate negotiations between the different oil producers on the market share question. Now, what's happened in the oil market over the last month is not just due to coronavirus and the fall in demand. It's also due to the fact that there is a fierce competition for market share between particularly the Saudis, OPEC, the Russians, and the US shale industry. And there is no agreement on their shares of what is at the moment a limited market. I don't think that's a permanent situation. I think we've had these conflicts between OPEC and other producers before. They lead to a lot of price volatility, which has obviously been compounded by the coronavirus in the last few weeks. But I do think the history is that they come to a conclusion. And I'm very interested to keep reading the reports on the quiet dialogue that is going on between the Russians and the Saudis, between the Americans and the Russians, and so on. I think all the players, all the producers have an interest in stability. They don't have an interest in prices being at $25 a barrel. And I suspect in the end, these economic interests will produce some sort of outcome. I don't think we'll be rebounding back to $80 or $100 a barrel, but I do think there'll be a turnaround.
Thank you, Nick. A final question before we round off today, Nick. How do you think this dramatic world situation will be summed up in the future, seen from a kind of people, energy, and economy perspective?
It's a great question, and if I knew the answer, I'd know where to invest and what was going to happen, which I don't. I think overall we will see it as one of the products of globalization. The fact that we are no one, even the UK is not an island anymore. These things can travel invisibly across borders much more quickly than we expected. And I think there'll be a lot of precautionary action now, preparing for the next one, the next similar attack. And in a way, that's fighting the last war. but I think it is one of the things that will now shape people's expectations of public policy and of politicians. I don't actually think we'll descend into a trade war. I think when this is over, there will be a sigh of relief and people will go back to the wider agenda, which is an unequal world, but a world where those who are fortunate enough to have resources still want to travel, still want to live comfortable lives, and still use energy. So I don't see this as something that tears up the whole world that we've known. I think it will make people think again. I think it will probably at the margin make governments bigger and the tax burden bigger. It may, in conjunction with other things, lead to a somewhat different energy mix, but not dramatically quickly. And I think it will all make us reflect on our own mortality.
Thank you so much for your sharp and valuable insights, Nick. It's been great having you with us today. To those of you who has followed, say again,
it's
Nick?
a pleasure, Ørjan, and I'd like to wish everybody who gets to see this or hear this, I hope you're all safe and well, and that we meet again soon.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. And to those of you who has followed our session, we really hope you enjoyed it. And we look forward to have you with us in the coming Energy Talk sessions and the journey towards our ONS 2020 event in Stavanger, starting on August 31st. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Goodbye.